I think we're good to go.
Excellent. I guess we want to look at the last 4 weeks of stuff that's happened.
Didn't we have a meeting 2 weeks ago? I believe
so long ago. Yeah, I guess we did. Some of this looks
you were
familiar.
in Montreal at the time.
Yes, that's right. That's why it escaped my memory. So yeah, looking at what's happened in the last weeks, two kind of interesting things to learn from bugs. One of them was I forgot to update the last version of TaskWarrior on TaskWarrior.org when we made the release. So 3.1.0 wasn't linked there. And we have gotten, I think, 4 bugs now complaining about the build error in 3.02.
Oh.
And I was confused as to why people were building 3.02, but never, I didn't just ask the question, but Felix did. And it turns out it was because the website wasn't updated. So
okay.
Yeah, so there was a bug in 3.02 that only appeared with newer versions of Rust that weren't released at that time. So at the time the release was made, it built just fine, but then like a week later it stopped building. And that has been biting people repeatedly, but hopefully we'll stop now that we've documented that 3.1 is the most recent release.
Okay.
The other interesting thing we ran across was when tasks sync, if you give it a wrong URL, it crashes with a sig pipe signal. And this was kind of an interesting way to learn that if you're writing to a network socket and the other end hangs up on you, you get a sig pipe. So this happens when we're to task sync. TaskWarrior puts a version object together, which is, hundreds of kilobytes or something. It tries to send it, and it sends it to the wrong URL. So that web server is sort of like, I don't know what you're talking about, go away, and it hangs up the connection.
Right.
And ordinarily, that sig pipe would be ignored through a number of different means, and just handled as a regular error. So you'd get back an error that says, the website responded with a 400 or a 404 or whatever response code.
Okay.
But we were getting this sig pipe error instead. So it has no error message. It just returns to the prompt. And if you look at the exit status, it says there was a signal failure. So not very user friendly. You think it worked. It just didn't print anything. And actually, no, it didn't work at all. And it turns out that long ago, Rust decided to ignore signals at startup, but that only happens in Rust binaries. In Rust is the actual binary, but we in TaskWarrior are building the binary with Clang in C++ and just embedding Rust in it. So that bit to ignore sig pipe never happens. And some Rust crates also additionally ignore, there's flags you can pass to ignore the sig pipe or to handle this in different ways. But one of those crates, UREC, I think, don't quote me on that, doesn't ignore pipes. And that's fine if you're using that in a Rust binary. But because we're using it in a non-Rust binary, it means that this signal doesn't get handled and kills the process. So it's kind of an interesting chase through TaskWarrior to Task Champion to the request library that we're using to the UREC library that it depends on to Rust itself to figure out where this bug was. And once we got to the end of that, kind of chased the chain the other way and explained what was going on and all these different issues I'd opened in GitHub. And everyone said, oh, I didn't know that. So I think a bunch of people learned something from this, but it was an interesting chase for a bug. And the fix was just to ignore the sig pipe in TaskWarrior. So it was a simple fix in the end. That's kind of a cool bug to chase down.
So if you've given it the wrong URL, how do you know that it's not connecting to your repository and updating then?
Because you get back an HTTP response with an error code in it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
What the issue was that error code was getting ignored, and it was just terminating the process with no further output. So now that we ignore the sig pipe, you get back an error response, and you read that 404 or 400 or 500 or whatever HTTP status code, and then that comes out as a message on the command line. Could not sync, and then whatever the error message from that was. So at least you get something that says it didn't work.
Yeah, that sounds much more useful then.
Yeah. But it's interesting that we had to chase all the way down into the Rust compiler to fix that sort of lack of an error message. And this, I know there were more issues we fixed. There were contributed issues. Let me see if I can find those. Right. So we added, Scandinavian added a new replica method to return just pending tasks. Two new methods actually, either return their UUIDs or the entire task definition. And it does that by joining the working set with the task table in a way that's very normal to anyone who's used a database. That sounds very normal, but we weren't doing it before. Before we were getting each task with a different query, and it was super slow. And that was part of the sort of performance cliff in TaskWarrior 3.0. This was probably the easiest, the most impactful fix we could make in terms of performance. So Scandinavian, I think first or very nearly first contribution to TaskWarrior, and was very effective. Went through a few rounds of review. This isn't quite ready for TaskWarrior yet, so we need to do a Task Champion release and then use it in TaskWarrior. So we're not quite ready to ship this new functionality, but it's halfway done, and we'll take it from there. And there's other performance work going on based. Felix is doing a little bit of analysis of what's the slow bits, and we have a few other things that we know we can fix. So performance work is ongoing, and TaskWarrior should get faster over the next few releases, and this is kind of one of the steps in that process.
Oh, that sounds really outstanding.
Yeah. And work on the operations, on exposing operations, is basically exactly where it was last meeting, which is to say, I haven't written any new code. I think we still have a path forward here to be able to get task history in a way that we can print in the task info command to say, this task was started at this time, stopped at this time, added this tag at this time, that sort of thing. But I think I figured out how to do it, but haven't written the code to do it yet. So the 3.2 release will come when both of those things are fixed, because right now it's kind of an in-between state that we wouldn't want to make a new release for. But we'll finish those two things in Task Champion, use them in TaskWarrior, and then make the 3.2 release. And it should be faster, and it should have history and task info, both of which are things people want. So,
wow, that sounds like excellent progress.
Yeah, I think we're doing okay.
And are you thinking that that's like in the next 2 weeks or next month, or going to take a little longer than that yet?
2 weeks probably sounds tight. The next 4 weeks seems reasonable.
Okay.
There's a little bit of lining things up there where we need to finish stuff in Task Champion, do a Task Champion release, and then build the TaskWarrior stuff on top of that. So that those have to happen sequentially. So that makes it take a little longer.
Excellent.
But again, like half this work that I just talked about, I didn't do. Other people have been doing that are contributing to the project, and that, especially with the way we structure the project, very little of it has to be sequential in the way I just talked about. So the more sort of contributions we can get working on the project, that'll contribute to things moving more quickly. So that's great to see.
Yeah, it's really terrific to see more and more people coming on board and even trying, what did you call them? Good first issues to work on, right?
Yeah.
I think that's super terrific.
Yeah, and we have some good first issues in all sorts of sizes. So some of them are just adding tests. In Rust, especially, that can be a good way to get a little bit of Rust written in a relatively innocuous way, because it's hard to break anything by writing a test, but you learn something about how the code works and how to make a PR and things like that, all the way up to writing a new sync backend that uses Git, which is possible, but that's going to be quite a bit of work and thinking and understanding how sync works and stuff like that. And then there's similar stuff in TaskWarrior. There's various sizes of bugs for people. So yeah, I'm happy to help people find those. One of my favorite things to do in software engineering is work with people that are new to a code base to make a new contribution. So I'd be happy to have anyone step up to any of those projects.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
I think that's all I've got.
That's very cool. Thank you very much.
Yep.
In the last couple of weeks, I've been putting out those questionnaires, no, polls, I guess you call them. I've done 6 or 7 of them at this point, and I've got lots of ideas, but they're not terribly good ideas going forward. I've used most of my best ideas so far. So if you have any ideas for good questions for polls, I like the first couple didn't get a whole lot of traction, but as we've done them fairly consistently, I notice more and more interaction. And I feel it makes Discord just a little bit more lively.
Yeah.
So
I'm scrolling back to look at them.
yeah, like the last one was about interacting with TaskWarrior. I was kind of surprised at how many people use Task.
Yeah, that's pretty strong domination there.
Right?
I think something I'd like to hear about is what kinds of integrations people are using. So personally, I use BugWarrior, and maybe I could break that down into the things I connect to with BugWarrior because it's kind of a general purpose tool. But if people are using other kind of ways to either get tasks into their set of tasks or exporting them somehow to some other tool, that would be good to know about, because I think a lot of those either places that people are using things or where people wish there was a tool would be good places for developers to focus on. And we're getting to a point now where we can build other tools that integrate really nicely with TaskWarrior through Task Champion.
Cool.
So I think the one we talk about a lot is an Android or phone app. I don't have the skills to do that, but there's definitely a need for that.
Yes.
But maybe there's other things that people would love to have integrations with that we could facilitate with Task Champion that would be an easier win than writing an Android app.
Are you familiar with a couple of the integrations that already exist? Like you talked about BugWarrior, and I think there's probably one for, is it Slack? I haven't looked at that list for a really long time. If Matt was here, he would know probably off the top of his head. But
yeah, I don't see anything about Slack in the tools list, but that may just be my failure to search properly.
maybe. More likely my faulty memory.
Yeah, that tools list is very, very long. And
It
I
is.
think a lot of those are either sort of partial solutions that work for the person that wrote them, or only work with TaskWarrior 2.0, or have various reasons that you might not want to use them. And getting a sense for either which ones people are using or which ones people wish were more up to date or had an alternative for would be useful. And I wonder if long term maybe we can have a better listing of these, so that people looking for a tool aren't surprised when they kind of say, "Oh, look at this, a tool to make LaTeX templates for your coursework. That's exactly what I need." And then you find out that it really doesn't work. Like that's a disappointing transition. And if that was kind of upfront that this only worked 7 years ago and hasn't been touched since.
Yeah.
Although now that I look at it, there is some information about that on the website now.
Yes.
Project is dormant.
Mm.
Actually, that might already be in place now that I'm looking.
Would it be useful to know how many projects people have or contexts?
I don't know if that'd be useful for me
Mm.
directly. it'd be interesting. Let's say interesting and not necessarily useful. But that
Interesting
gives
is
me
good
the
enough.
idea that, well, I work on Chrome, and Chrome measures everything. You basically can't ship functionality in Chrome without measuring it. So there's thousands and thousands of metrics that Chrome sends home. And I'm not
Mm,
telling stories. These are in the source code. You can go look.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and those do let you get a good picture of, if you're thinking of working on something in Chrome and you want to know, how often does this particular combination of things happen? You can
Mm,
actually usually dig into the metrics and figure out that,
mm,
10% of page loads use this functionality, or 0.001% of page loads use this functionality, and make a
mhm.
decision on that basis. And it might be useful to have more comprehensive information about TaskWarrior like that. Um,
Oh.
the, the flip side to that, and the reason not to do that in typical open source software, is you're sort of spying on your users that way. So we would definitely want that to be opt-in, but we'd want to make a way that enough people opt in that we're getting a good message. And I
Mm,
think we'd have to have some rationale for what we're going to do with the data instead of just, it'd be cool to know. But it would be cool in that sense to have a really comprehensive, a really reliable number for how many projects do people typically have, how many tasks do people typically have, how many of them are pending, how many contexts, like you mentioned, how many tags, what is the distribution of number of tags on a task. Those kinds of questions could help us make performance decisions, because I think
yeah.
I made some assumptions about those numbers based on my usage, which turned
Mhm.
out to not match other people's usage. And that's part of what we found out with the 3.0 release, was that people
Mm.
have tens of thousands of tasks. And that seems wild to me, right? Like,
Right,
of course,
right.
that's not going to work very well, but it worked okay for them in 2.x, and then it got a lot worse in 3.x because I didn't imagine that people would have 10,000 tasks. So having at least that kind of large scale outline of how do people use TaskWarrior in a database that we could query somewhere would be useful in making future decisions. And I think
Mm.
we could do so in a super anonymous way, where just 10% of the time it asks some really basic count questions about your use of TaskWarrior and sends that data without any user identifiers. Like, we would never send task content or anything like that.
Right, right.
It would need to be approached carefully, but might be an interesting project to work on.
I wonder if we would, of course, get the community's permission to do something like that, but also open source the data so
Right.
that it's not like, oh, there's some cabal of developers that are using this, or some management group that's monetizing it, or like it's open to everyone, and everyone can
Yeah.
see what's going on.
And I think that limits what data you can collect, or it
Mhm.
can limit what data you can collect. But I think the data we would want is sufficiently not specific that we could easily just make it publicly available. Like the Chrome data isn't publicly available, and I think there's probably good reasons for that, because there's a lot of it, and it's very personal stuff what people are doing with Chrome.
Right.
Um, but for just counts of tasks and TaskWarrior, I think we could argue that should be public. And with an opt-in, we could make a case for this.
Hmm.
I'm saying all of this to say it'd be a cool idea, not necessarily something I would be planning on working on anytime in the future. But if someone is interested in working on something like that, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Hmm. Yeah, I could see a lot of benefit coming out of that.
We did something similar with BuildBot at one point. So I have some experience with going through the process and making the arguments for this and figuring out how to do the opt-in. And that did help a lot with decision making as to what functionality to work on in BuildBot and what kind of bugs people were running into and things like that. It's a
Mm.
valuable process.
Do you have any documentation, like not specific documentation, but like set an SOP or something like that for going through a process like that?
No, I think,
Okay.
and it was long enough ago in BuildBot that I've forgotten most of it, but I could probably go back to mailing lists, archives, and things like that and see
Yeah.
how that process went there.
And maybe there's already open source process somewhere that
Right,
we
right.
could.
Actually, there's a couple books on that sort of thing.
Oh,
I don't know if they would cover it.
I love that you have books. As an author, I just love that.
Yeah. So Carl Fogel wrote Producing Out Open Source Software. It's
Mm.
coming out with a new version soonish. So so I don't know if that will include it, but producing open source software. And this talks about a lot of things like that. But it's a little dated, and it talks about setting up like a mailman listserv, which I think nobody does anymore. So, but I can look through here and see if there's anything about catching metrics. I won't do it live on the call. Something to check.
Yeah. No, that sounds terrific. Wow.
Yeah, I wish I could get that. The lighting doesn't work out to have that bookcase in the background, but it's actually a bookcase full of classic computer software books like this one.
That's amazing. It really is.
I'll have to get yours in there now.
I would be very honored. All right. I think that's everything that I had in mind. And seems like you've wrapped up your bit.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn off the recording at this point. But thank you so much. And for everyone who's watching, hope to see you next time at our new time of, well, I was going to say 10 a.m., but